Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Richard Lewis Show, a very special one this time around, because today I'm going to be talking with one of the leading authorities on the practice of sports washing. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. We're going to tell you about that in just a moment. It is a good friend of mine, a colleague, Karim Zidan, an award-winning, pioneering journalist. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you for that wonderful intro, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Well, look, there's so much to get into in 90 minutes. So I'll just ask the question, right off the top. Obviously, you and me, we do very similar kinds of work in our respective fields. That's kind of how we got to know each other. And I guess just to start off, people always say to me, like, why do you do it? Because there's not really a lot of glory in the types of stories that, we report on. You anger a lot of very dangerous people. The people who make money from sports and esports obviously don't like it, because anything that harms the image stops sponsors coming in, and you end up walking a really lonely road and always looking over your shoulder while you're doing it. So, why did you decide to kind of specialize on this particular field?
I don't think I ever took a conscious decision right off the bat to say, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to make my name doing.
Hmm.
A lot of this was organic, and I've said this before in previous interviews. It really does feel, when I look back on it with hindsight being 2020, that uh, you know you take certain forks in the road, you choose a certain direction, that's where it leads you. At no point was I 100% certain what was going to happen throughout my career, but I can say it's organic because there are incidents that really factored into it. For instance, when I first started writing about mixed martial arts, it was really my first job in journalism, was on a blog that I still do work for, called
Yeah,
bloodyelbow.com.
great blog. Yeah.
I do a lot of my investigative stuff in the sports there still to this day. But when I first started working for them, I was doing these interviews. I was trying to be, the self-starter, trying to get as much content out as I possibly can, stick out in whatever way possible. So I interviewed this Russian mixed martial arts fight league, and the president there was this quite infamous character in mixed martial arts at the time called Vadim Finkelstein. He was also the manager of at the time, the most renowned MMA fighter of all time, Fedor
Yeah.
Emelianenko. So I thought, this is going to be an interesting interview. Let's see what happens. We go on 20, 30 minutes, etc. And then the translator, who happened to be the PR person as well at the time, Daria, she turns to me and she says, you know what, Karim, Vadim has something to ask you. And Vadim asks this question in Russian. She translates it and says, oh, we like the way you speak. Would you like to come do some commentary for us at M1 in Russia? And at the time, I was so early in my career, I didn't really know where I was going, left or right. I wasn't even know if I was going to stick to being a journalist. It just seemed like
Mm.
something that interested me at a university. And I thought, you know what, screw this, let's do it. Let's give it a go. And it was those trips to Russia. I ended up making, 13, 14 trips to Russia and a lot of the neighboring countries, Georgia, Azerbaijan. I went to all sorts of fascinating places in Russia: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Sochi, Orenburg, Ingushetia in the North Caucasus. It really was a remarkable experience. And apart from being so immersed in Russian culture at the time and making so many friends and expanding my network, it also was being in Russia for such a lengthy period of time that taught me about corruption in sports, politics in sports, and really getting to witness it firsthand and have a lot of people willing to talk to me about it. That wasn't going to happen if I was just sitting at home trying to write these stories. I had to be there completely involved in a different field, being a commentator rather than a journalist, being able to sit down with people and have drinks and have a shisha and have some food and have them open up to you. That was really the key thing here. I never ended up, going behind anyone's back and writing things they didn't want written, but it was this sort of information on background that I was getting about Russia, about, who were these oligarchs in influence, who were these dictators rising up and starting to open up fight leagues, as I'm sure we'll get into later with Ramzan Kadyrov. All that I learned by sitting and having, vodka, beers, and, all sorts of food with Russians. So when I really say that getting into investigative journalism was this organic experience, it really was. It took me accepting these trips to Russia to really even be introduced to this world. So
Mm.
you really never know where things take you. As I always say now, just say yes to opportunities. You really never know.
Yeah, I used to have a phrase. I used to say you got to open yourself to extreme possibilities, and if you
Exactly.
do, generally interesting things will happen. Also, as well, just as a piece of advice, I remember David Simon in his preface for the homicide book that he wrote, he quoted another journalist who said, the best journalists just hang out. And that's certainly true in my experience when I came into esports. I was like you, I'd written about other subcultures prior to getting into like gaming and competitive gaming. Like, for example, I'd written an article. I went on the road with a freak show, a modern day freak show, like an S&M German freak show called the Carnival of the Bizarre. And I
Sounds
wanted.
very cool.
Oh yeah, it was. I saw some shit. Yeah, but I wanted to write about kind of like interesting, like what it would be like if you were new to this particular scene. Give somebody the inside track and kind of turn over the stones. And the more and more I started writing about esport, what stood out for me immediately was just the number of bad actors that there were. And there was this disconnect because, like mainstream sports, you've got young people that provide the talent and the results, and that's what drives the interest in the industry, in the sport. And around them are people that prey on that, and they tell lies and they break promises. They put talent into terrible contracts. And, we're talking about young adults, essentially, people that are vulnerable, maybe not very worldly, some people from, broken homes. And the more I saw, the more I was like, if I leave, like, is another Richard Lewis going to come along and talk about this stuff? And, it took a long time before there was anyone else covering the kind of beat I was in my space. I don't know if you found that similar, a similar experience, a similar outlook, for you.
Well, I immediately related to you in the very beginning, right off the top, when you were talking about how lonely this space can be for journalists like us. Absolutely. To this day, I feel that I might have just been repeating that phrase to a friend of mine just a couple of days ago. A friend who was also asking, "Why are you still here then?" And yeah, I mean, I guess you're lucky that you might have found others who are sort of on that beat right now. I don't think there's anybody else covering that, at least in the combat sports and mixed martial arts space. I haven't seen anybody else go to the lengths I've gone to, uncover corruption, authoritarianism, etc. in the space. We are seeing it expand in other sports, which is wonderful.
Mm.
You've got some fantastic journalists really covering issues about women's equality in sports. The current sexual abuse scandals that have been
Yeah.
taking place throughout the world of sports. You've got excellent journalists covering that. Absolutely. You've got sports washing in football that's being covered phenomenally by journalists like Miguel Delaney at The Independent.
Mm.
But honestly, you can still, at the end of the day, count them on one hand. Not even two hands, just one hand at this point. And that's all sports.
Yeah.
So we desperately need more people to sort of get into this industry and to start reporting. But it's lonely for multiple reasons, Richard. It's not just because, it's tough work or, you need a certain type of personality to do it. Well, it's not just that. The space and the industry is not as healthy as it once used to be. I'm talking
Mm.
in terms of, the job opportunities out there, what you're actually going to be paid for the amount of work that you're doing and the risks you're taking. The benefits aren't exactly the same. It's all changed so dramatically now that it's very hard to tell what's coming next.
Yeah.
It's hard for people to stay in the space at that point unless you are independently wealthy or you have a spouse who can support you or happen to be one of the elite writers or in a specific niche where you are going to get paid for the work that you do. It is really difficult to be a part of this space consistently.
Mm. Yeah, I think as well, it's like, what's the upside? I think it's kind of interesting because it's like you can balance it out. I think Helwani does a good job of that. Like, I don't think he's like an out and out iconoclast. I think quite wisely he does steer away from certain topics, but equally he's done stories that have quite clearly upset the UFC. And, obviously there was a period of time where, he wasn't allowed at events. I think that was over the Brock reveal, where Dana got particularly upset. But it really is hard to kind of consistently do what I would call the important work, because even the people who pay you to do it, there's going to come a point where you have that awkward conversation. And I've had it with a number of editors back when I was a beat writer down the years. And they all say the same thing. It's like, can you find anything good to say this week? And if you don't, there's a real kind of pressure on you that this isn't helping anybody. I've had sponsors and, heavy hitters in esports pick up the phone and say to my editors, like, what are we going to do to shut them up? Like, how can we work this out? And, fortunately, even the editors that have been a little bit skeptical and cynical and, they wish I'd do a happy piece now and then, they've at least stood by me and not censored my work by and large. But it's been touch and go for some of the bigger stories, that's for sure.
And where do we get to this point where now, as journalists, we were expected to actually embody the role of a PR person on top of it? When did it become our job to produce positive stories? I'm not in control of the news cycle. If you have shitty people doing shitty things, I'm going to write about it. I still don't understand why I'm being blamed for that instead of the shitty person who's doing that.
Yeah,
it doesn't make sense.
Well, because what started happening is, and I know you know this, there's this more permissive idea about the shitty things. I mean, across the board, it really seems that we're willing to turn a blind eye to things that I feel just wouldn't have flown, a few decades ago. And obviously sports washing is the big one, the Saudi money, the Chinese money in the NBA, which isn't really sports washing. That's its own kind of unique thing. Obviously, the very close ties to, the Chechnyan human rights violations of Kadyrov in the MMA, him in the UFC, him being such a big figure in that sport is terrifying. And, people say the same thing. It's like, look, if we don't take the money, if we're not adjacent to these people, somebody else will be. In esports now, the excuse we have for all the Saudi money coming in is Formula One does it. Golf does it. Why shouldn't we? And it's very hard to kind of push back against that logic because people are taking the money, and the people that are being ethical are going to go out of business, and the people that are being unethical are going to thrive. So in that permissive culture, like I don't, I already feel like the battle's been lost in a lot of ways. All I can really do is chronicle it.
I always say that this is just one of the scourges of capitalism. Really, at the end of the day, is that once you're at this level of competition, money means everything. It's your bottom line and it's your profit margins. They mean everything, and they come at the expense of any sort of ethical concerns, moral obligations, social responsibilities, anything along those lines take a back seat to your bottom line at the end of the day. And it's something we've seen throughout the world of sports. Unfortunately, that's also seeped into the world of journalism, because a lot of these corporations or these media outlets are run by big entities that want to see profit somehow. That's also another concept that doesn't make sense to me. All these venture capitalist firms that are running these media organizations, expecting them to make big money, either pivoting to video or pivoting to fancy headlines or something along those lines. And it's really frustrating because journalists come to the point now where they are fighting for access. And if you don't have access, you're no longer in the space. And that's a problem, because it really leads us down to the same exact thing here. You need this. Okay, Richard, we're going to actually have to stop for 1 second because my cat's driving me crazy here.
No worries, that's fine.
That question.
No worries, it's good. Well, anyway, look, so you'd move nicely on to the eternal issue, which is access. If you're writing the unpopular stories, access is the eternal problem, and you can't really do much without it. You have to be in the buildings because you got to talk to people. You have to be allowed at the events. You don't want to get blacklisted. You don't want to get a reputation as being, oh, don't talk to him, he's looking to write a nasty story about you every time they see you. And sometimes you just need to do an interview, just something for content, just for clicks, really, because that's the nature of the business. That's the nature of the industry. That's how we all get paid.
It's frustrating though because it doesn't have to be this way. It's assuming that everybody is a beat reporter or following the same type of reporting. There's many different ways to report on a story.
Mm,
And honestly, the more I get blacklisted from various outlets, the more creative I've had to be,
mm,
the more I've learned about the writing process, the more I've switched over to long form or narrative pieces, or the way I do investigative stories, or the lengths I'll go to get a source.
mm.
For instance, I'll give you an example. This dates back to like 2015. The UFC wanted nothing to do with me from back then, but I really wanted to do a story on Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was on the rise at the time. This is
Of
long
course.
before he even became a UFC champion. So I thought to myself, Khabib won't talk to me. His father, his manager, hates me, won't talk to me either. And I just thought about it and I thought about it and thought about it until I thought, okay, you know what? I know a bunch of people in Russia, some of them who introduced me to his father, Abdul Manab. Let me see what I can do about that. And eventually I managed to secure an interview with his father. It will go down as one of the best stories I ever wrote and got anthologized in a book and everything. And it remains one of those pieces I love going back to and looking at. And
Mm.
that was something I did without having access to the central figure of the story, being Khabib.
Yeah.
So there's ways around stuff like that. I find that a lot of journalists use the concept of losing access as an excuse
Mm.
just to avoid any sort of conflict. Some people really just hate conflict. They don't want
Yeah.
to be in conflict. They don't see their job as being in conflict. If you're covering mixed martial arts, some of these people say, okay, you know what? My job is just to be here and to write about the fighters and to write about the experience and the cage. I don't want to fight or argue with anybody. Well, the truth is, this entity, the UFC, doesn't respect you. They think you're their slave. They think you
Mm.
work for them, basically, and that you're their bitch, actually, to
Yeah.
put it correctly. So it's really your choice. You can either have no conflict and actually be their bitch, or you can stand up for yourself and actually do your job.
Yeah.
So,
I used to tell them all the time, whenever I got blacklisted, I just used to be like, the one thing you can't stop me is writing about you. So we can do it where we have like a dialogue channel, or I can just hammer you every week about all the heinous shit you're doing without getting any color or context because you won't talk to me. So it's up to you. And, eventually, whenever I was blacklisted by an entity, those blacklists typically never lasted. There would always be a period where they needed me to like, oh, you're going to hear some shit behind the scenes, but we'd really like to, before you write about it, we'd really like to clarify. And I'm like, well, what? Am I not blacklisted now? Then I guess. And, yeah, a lot of young journalists, especially, they fear being on the bad side of the kind of the power players, but it doesn't really matter if you want to, if the types of work you're doing don't require, a VIP pass, and
mhm.
rarely the important stories. I think you write them better if you're an outsider a lot of the time, honestly.
I
Uh,
completely agree. You
yeah.
don't have that, but I think people really underestimate the significance of the bias and the onus to produce a story that makes the organization happy when they've done so much for you. Say you're a young journalist and they paid for your flights or they paid for your accommodation, or they've been really good to you all week and you're making friends with the PR person. Even if it's just subconscious, even if your whole intention has always been, I'm going to write the story that I see or write about my experience here, anything along those lines, just the little subconscious thought of, well, they've done so much for me. What are they going to think after they've paid for my, my hotel and my flights? Maybe I should remove this section. Maybe I shouldn't include this. You reach your own point where you're doing your own self-censorship at that point.
Mm.
So I think people really need to realize that whatever relationship you have, what you think is a friendly relationship with one of these sports organizations, whatever entity that you're covering around the world, if it's too friendly, it's costing you good work at that point.
Yeah.
You might be getting access, but you're always only getting the thing that they want you to have. They're
Yeah.
only ever going to give you what they want you to have, which makes you just an extension of their PR at that point.
Mm.
That's just not something that interests me. In MMA, that would be, for instance, announcing a fight, or oh, this big fight's going to happen on this card. Well, great, you just did what the UFC does. They just used your 200,000 or whatever Twitter followers to promote something to your fan
Yeah.
base that they could have done themselves. Does that really make you much of a journalist? I'm not 100% sure. It is its own form of journalism, but it's so limited. And I think that young journalists getting into the space only see that because it's the primary thing they see in front of them and don't realize that they have a whole world of opportunity out there for them.
Yeah. Um, Look, we'll come back to the UFC stuff because I grew up with the UFC. I followed it back in the days when I think my first UFC was number three, the first one I ever watched. I've seen it go from being this niche thing where it couldn't get, the right licenses and people were still fighting in their gis and you had multiple fights in a day and all to where it's at now, where it's, just another money-making mainstream sport. And I've certainly got a lot of concerns about where it's headed and the kind of people that are in and around that now. But let's just have a general talk about sports washing, because it's a very common term that's coming up increasingly now as Saudi Arabia, the Public Investment Fund in particular, increases its position across a multiple number of sports and now obviously esports. So just as you understand it, if a layperson was to ask you how you would define what sports washing is and what its purpose is, how would you explain it?
Sports washing is basically a form of image laundering. It is how governments utilize and weaponize sports to improve their public image or to distract from human rights abuses. So, in most cases, when we talk about sports washing, we're referring to authoritarian regimes, flat out. We're talking about primary examples just this year alone would be China, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, of course. Those are the key examples. But honestly, once this, the veil of sports lifts from a lot of people's eyes, they start to really see all the connections around the world and just how many governments are guilty of this, to be honest with you. And we were just talking about the Formula One a little while ago. Well, that's an organization that's seen a significant rise in its fan base over the last while, but also the amount of deals they've made with some horrible regimes around the world. It's just awful to see, to be honest with you. And it started with Bahrain. They've been going to Bahrain for well over 15, 16, 17 years now. I mean, I lived in Bahrain once upon a time when I was a teenager, and those were during the early years of the Formula One. I attended it at the time. Oh, so that was a while ago, and that was an early example of sports washing.
Yeah.
An early example at the time. So we're seeing cases of sports washing take place all around the world. As a matter of fact, the blueprint that's been laid out is now just being utilized over and over again. We've seen probably the worst cases of sports washing take place this year, a year bookended by an Olympic Games in China to start and a World Cup in Qatar to finish it off. So
I
really
know.
just a horrific example and proof that the situation's only getting worse with each passing year now.
Yeah, I think as well, to add to that, and you can tell me if you disagree, I think there's almost an extra sinister element to it, especially now as it's become more widespread and the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia is in everything across entertainment, sports, and even as we're finding out recently with the Wall Street Journal report, it's even rebuilding, pre the invasion of Ukraine, it was rebuilding Russian infrastructure, $2 billion worth. So, I mean, for me, I think it's almost like, yes, it is about, hey, we're the Saudi Arabians. Here's Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, shaking people's hands at events. There he is waving to the crowd. It's all there's nothing bad about these people. They're regular world leaders like yours, like you might vote for in, Germany or Norway or Sweden. They're just everyday normal folk. They certainly wouldn't torture anybody or do anything horrible. So I think there is that component to it. But I also think there is now a purchased silence because the money goes everywhere. So imagine how can America, especially given its, energy needs, as well as the fact that the Saudi money is in everything from Disney to, golf. How can they ever speak up about human rights violations in that regime? Because Saudi Arabia can just turn that tap off, and that's billions. That's billions and billions of money just gone immediately overnight. And so I think, and certainly with Qatar as well, who's going to sit out a World Cup? Which nation's going to boycott a World Cup? Turns out none of them. None of the major nations have done that. Even England sent out Gareth Southgate to apologize essentially and say, listen, I don't think anything would be gained by us not going. And they're going to play in stadiums built with literal slave labor where people just died and got buried in the foundations of the stadiums like they never existed at all. And I think that's the extra sinister element that at the start, 20, like you say, the early Bahrain, Formula Ones, that was kind of like the image washing part of it. Now it feels to me we're getting to a part where there's this implication. If you speak out against the regime, if you speak out against Saudi, you speak out against China, we'll just take the money away. And now you're fucked because you were relying on that for so long.
Well, you saw that with China and the NBA, absolutely, right? So as soon as any NBA coaches or any NBA officials, any NBA athletes attempted to speak out, China immediately, blocked certain games from
Yeah.
appearing in China, canceled sponsorship deals, etc. And of course, the NBA reeling goes back, with its tail between its legs and apologizes to China, the authoritarian regime, of course. But yes, you absolutely raise probably the largest issue, and the thing I find to be the most concerning at the moment is that there is simply too much money on the line. And it doesn't just limit itself to the world of sports, because as we've seen, Joe Biden going and, fist bumping Mohammed bin Salman after running on a campaign that said he would turn Saudi and bin Salman into a pariah on the global stage. Well, so much for a pariah. Yesterday, they were just a few days ago, they were begging Saudi and OPEC not to decrease the amount of oil
Yeah.
production per year. They're begging them for that. It goes to show you the state of not necessarily just democracy, but the democratic institutions and countries that are supposed to be these bastions of democracy around the world. Clearly, they are failing us as well,
Yeah.
both in their governments, their long-term dependency on countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia for energy was always going to put them at such a disadvantage. It's very unfortunate that we didn't attempt to deal with something like this beforehand. But Richard, at least we know now what we're up against. Divesting entirely might be an unrealistic concept at this point, but divestment still remains an option. And
Sure.
divesting is something that uh, terrifies boycotts and divestment, something that terrifies a lot of countries. You've got Israel, a country that's been accused of being an apartheid state as well by many human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. One of the things they absolutely despise is the IDS, is the BDS movement. Popularized by a lot of Palestinians. Why? Because boycotts and divestment actually works. So even though we're really fighting, we're at this point Sisyphus coming up the mountain. It's a very much an uphill battle, but there are still options to be had. It begins with distancing yourself as much as possible when it comes to energy consumption, when it comes to accepting all sorts of investments from Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, it's easy to say that to a government or to implement a government policy. Well, governments can't also control all the private entities that are going to be taking this money. You see this in the world of boxing, where at this point, we're going to really see the vast majority of major boxing events take place in Saudi. Why? Because Saudi's offering the most money for these events. Nobody else can compete. Eddie Hearn and all these other managers and all these other, promoters are obviously going to go to Saudi Arabia when Saudi's offering tens and tens and tens of millions as just a hosting fee, as a site fee. Not even the payments to the athletes at that point. It would be fiscally irresponsible for them to turn down that kind of money. So we need to get to a position somehow where that's just not an option. Because as we've seen, outrage or incidents of egregious human rights abuse, even say the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, wasn't enough to turn the world against Saudi Arabia. Sure,
No.
there was the temporary outrage. You even had Endeavor, WME IMG Endeavor, the owners of the UFC, and Ari Emanuel saying he wants nothing to do with Saudi Arabia. Well, that only lasted so long, and it was, hypocritical coming from a guy who had ties to the United Arab Emirates anyway. But
Yeah.
and that's what the UFC has. But for a while, we had people turning away from Saudi Arabia. That's no longer the case anymore. That's just gone. As a matter of fact, it didn't even last that long. The WWE went and hosted an event called the Crown Jewel in Saudi
Correct,
Arabia.
yeah.
I think it was 2 weeks after Khashoggi's assassination. And he was sliced up with a bone saw. This wasn't something that we couldn't prove, you couldn't confirm, you couldn't anything. He was sliced up with a bone saw. And that still didn't stop Vince McMahon's WWE from heading over to Saudi Arabia. This is the problem right now. There's so much money. They are absolutely in control, whether it be in the world of esports. Actually, esports terrifies me greatly because they're going to be reaching a new, younger audience as well. You started seeing that with, before we get into esports, with Live Golf, the most recent golf stuff. You can even see that the way they're presenting this golf a tournament or league or however you want to describe it as one for a younger audience. They've reached a point of confidence right now, Saudi Arabia, that their sports washing is no longer limited to image laundering. As you said, that was stage one sports washing. We've now reached a stage where they believe they are powerful enough to challenge long-standing institutions in the world of sports. The PGA has been around for over 100 years. They thought within a couple of years that they could just get rid of them.
Yeah,
and that's what they didn't.
I think they've got a point. I mean, they've had a lot of kind of support from people that I don't think they've been bought or paid for. I think they're just speaking their mind. But I used to work for Turner Sports, and I know Charles Barkley. I've had the pleasure of meeting him a few times. I used to work in the studio right next to him. We appeared on Inside the NBA when we were promoting my TV show, and he's a guy who makes up his own mind about things. But he literally said, like, very openly, like, fuck trying to, fuck the PGA, essentially, trying to stop these other guys getting paid. If they want to make their money, everyone else is doing it. Why not them? And that's the problem. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. The money is everywhere, but people have to start saying no to it, or we're going to have even more problems down the road. Because if this is stage two, I dread to think what stage three is.
Well, we're seeing a bit of that with the world of esports, I think, and you would know far better than I would. But the fear I have is that now, by starting, I mean, it's bad enough that they have a gamer crown prince, right? And at this point, prime minister in Saudi Arabia. But that's what Mohammed bin Salman is known for, apparently, as being a gamer himself. So
Correct, yeah.
that would maybe be the obvious reason as to why he's interested in esports. I think personally, it's a phenomenal way to reach the young generation now. And to sort of secure them on your side from a young age. If we talk about, sports washing as a form of, say, subliminal messaging, trying to get your message across, or just while people have their guards down, watching something they love, their form of escapism, when you start throwing at them propaganda, they're going to be far more receptive to that propaganda. This applies to young, 12, 13, 14-year-olds playing games as well. If you start promoting that, if all their favorite games are made by, say, Saudi companies or companies owned by Saudi Arabia, and you see Saudi being promoted regularly, well, they're not going to think Saudi's such a big problem, are they? From a very, very young age, you secure all those people. Apart from, of course, all the jobs that they set up in Saudi Arabia in a way to actually distract their own population, but not through just forms of entertainment, by actually giving them good jobs and opportunities to stand out on a global stage. So really, it's getting to a point where Saudi's sports washing will also be providing a lot of domestic benefits to its own people. So how do you even fight that when the concepts become so complex, and what's right and what's wrong within it becomes so complex? It's no longer just about, oh, what does the West think about Saudi Arabia? Because Saudi is getting to a point now where it doesn't really matter. The West is going to come crawling to them anyway. That's where we have arrived at 2022. Might not have been the case last year. It most certainly is the case this year with the war in Ukraine and everything else. So Saudi's at a position where it is so powerful right now. They've probably hired the most talented and influential PR and lobbying and marketing firms that money can buy as well. I have seen the lobbying documents from when they came to the United States in 2018. They lobbied absolutely everybody, and they hired some serious firms and paid a lot of money. They went after talking to Twitch, they even talked to the World Surf League. There is no surfing there is no surfing in Saudi Arabia, but that didn't stop them. They're expanding to every corner they think they can. They have the money for it. They most certainly have the money for it.
In it must have been 2018. It might have been 2019, but I had a strange offer one day. I got a call from an esports colleague I know a lot of like owners and silent partners, investors. And I got a call from someone, and I drank with this guy, hung out with this guy. And he said, the Saudi Arabian government are throwing a junket. They want to get to know more about esports, and they're going to have a party on a private yacht. Do you want to come? And I went, absolutely fucking not. No, I don't. No, I don't even want to meet these people. And everyone was like, really, they were like, he was genuinely shocked at that. He was like, no, but it's free. It's like, there's going to be champagne. You're going to be on a yacht. You don't want to come and check this out? I'm like, no, I don't want to answer any of their questions. And frankly, I'm worried about coming off rude. I don't know what these people will do. So, but they've been chipping away at this for years. What we've got now is, as you say, I think they looked at the Chinese playbook, and what I mean by that is American corporations and companies. I know you know this, but for those watching that don't, if you want to do business in China, it is the law. You must partner with a Chinese company over there to act as your, partner, typically in the similar field. If you're a games developer, you'll partner with a games developer or distributor or someone that runs an online distribution platform or whatever over there, because it's just a law that the Chinese company has to get paid if anything's imported, essentially. So what's happened is the Chinese government has been able to strong arm a lot of American corporations, entertainment companies like Disney, again, fantastic example, but companies like Valve, Riot Games, that have American offices, but they do so much business in China, they're never going to speak up about any of the problems. You can't even get them to talk about match fixing in their own game, in their own sport, in that country without a nod from someone in China telling them it's okay. And I think Saudi Arabia looked at that and said, this is actually, in terms of getting that younger generation and making them complacent about these issues early, it absolutely does work. I've seen it. I go on Reddit and everything, and I'm always ranting about sports washing and Saudi Arabia, and I'm writing articles about it. And it's the same thing now. You've got 16-year-olds saying, yeah, but everyone takes Saudi money. They're pre-jaded about the topic. So you can't get them fired up about anything unless it's like, I don't know, American politics and Trump.
It's really strange because I don't remember being that apathetic at that age.
Yeah, crazy.
You know what I mean? When you're that young, that's usually when you're passionate about all the strangest things, from just like philosophical ideas to, political ideologies to all sorts of different things. That's when at least for me, I was all sorts of passionate about different things at the time. So it's strange to hear about that apathy at such a young age is terrifying, simply because we expect it. As me as a sports journalist, or as a journalist covering this world, I am far too used to the apathy of sports fans in general. They simply, for the most part, do not care. Do not want to care, do not see the significance. As long as it's not affecting them, why does it matter? And in a lot of cases, you're hearing from some of the most privileged people. If I'm writing about the issues of Ramzan Kadyrov and how he treats his own people, well, you get a lot of these Americans responding saying, why the fuck does this matter? Well, you privileged asshole, just because you're safe in your own home doesn't mean everybody else is. Yeah. This is significant. And not everybody there's simply no reason for everybody else to suffer just that you can watch two people punch each other in a cage. Yeah. Life does not rotate and revolve around you. Yet a lot of these people, especially sports fans, are used to having that sense of that feeling. Let's take it away from even politics entirely. Do you know how many MMA fans defend the UFC's abysmal pay for fighters?
Oh, yeah. I've had this argument so often, brother.
Most sports leagues, I'm sure you know this, Richard, but for your audience that doesn't, most sports leagues and the major ones really revenue split with the athletes at around 50%, 40-something to 50% of revenue is split with the athlete. That's because there are athlete associations for most of these organizations, from MLB to the NFL to the NBA, etc. They've got associations. There is no association in mixed martial arts, despite the fact that several people have attempted to start them. The UFC pays about 16% of its revenue. It's revenue that's skyrocketing over the past couple of years. Hell, they just brought Dwayne The Rock Johnson on as a sponsor with his shoes, the Project Rock shoes. And I wrote a piece for The Guardian showing that fighters aren't making a dime off that deal. That's just split between Under Armour and the UFC. Under Armour being the Rock's company, the main company, and the UFC. And most fight fans are like, so what? You're worth what you get paid for. You're worth what you do. This person doesn't do this. Why should he get paid what somebody else can get paid? Well, it's so easy for you to sit at home when you're so used to expecting that every week the UFC is going to give you this array of fights and violence that you're just going to watch. Well, of course you dehumanize the athletes. You've reached that point where you dehumanize the athletes. You're apathetic and you dehumanize everybody around you. So if we can't get them to even agree that the pay is too low, how am I even going to get these people interested in the political ramifications of these events? Not just in MMA, football. Football has this major problem. If you go on Miguel Delaney's Twitter, whenever he mentions sports washing or the World Cup or Qatar or anything along those lines, you've got tons of people. It gets even worse when he focuses on Newcastle United. Yeah. Because you've got your obsessed fan group, and that's perfectly fine. Listen, every football team has it. I've got it for Al Ahly in Egypt. There's teams that you love, and I get it. But I've always been able to recognize when my team's done something wrong, or an athlete I enjoy has done something wrong. People are complex. You can think of two. You can hold two thoughts in your head. But a lot of these fans just simply don't want to. They love their team. They will hear nothing bad about it. To the point that when the deal was first announced, you had people going up dressed in Saudi clothing. Are you kidding me? When they went to the stadium, God, sometimes I've been around this.
They asked us not to do that as well. They put a statement out saying, actually, this is really offensive.
Yes, it is. It's not just it's offensive. It's outrageous behavior all in all.
Yeah. Yeah, because Newcastle's my team, so it's kind of like the specter of sports washing is following me through my life, And I agree. I mean, I've supported that 1988. It's a hell of a long time, and the childhood team, and I find myself gravitating towards watching the games out of habit, but it's always in the back of my mind that realistically, I shouldn't be consuming anything from Newcastle now. I should be, I should pick another team. I should pick a grassroots team. I should go support Gateshead or something like that. But it's hard. It's very hard to walk away from something that's been a huge part of your identity. And I feel sorry for some sports fans because it's a choice that realistically you should never have to make. Things should have never got to this point. But yeah, I do advocate for boycotts and like you say,
so
divestment. It works.
So funny enough, sorry to interrupt you, but I don't actually necessarily write about what fans should do afterwards. I've presented my concerns. Say I've tied PSG to sports washing, for instance, done a piece on PSG. I'm not expecting PSG supporters to boycott PSG. That's not necessarily what I'm expecting. Almost because I've reached a point of cynicism where I simply do not expect fans to cooperate with that. But there are alternatives. You have power as a fan, and I think. Clubs have spent so many years devaluating that people simply have forgotten that they have influence. If you pressure something long enough, people will have to listen. And that's what you can do as a fan. First of all, like I said, people can carry more than one thought in their head. You can be aware, you can love your team and be aware of all the issues that your team is involved in. It's that love for your team, how people handle that. For instance, if you choose to ignore it or, make excuses for it, well, I question your love for that team, to be honest with you. But if you truly love the sport, if you love the team, you'll do what you can to get rid of this filth and garbage that's influencing your sports or your team or whatever. So that's what I'd like to see more of. I'd like to see more grassroots organizing when it comes to not necessarily implementing boycotts, but say your team is not doing enough for LGBTQ plus rights. Well, organize and be activists in that regard, because that's really the only step left at this point. Because you're certainly not going to be able to compete with money, but you are the viewers at the end of the day, and there's still something called TV ratings and social media numbers and things that they expect from you. if you sit silently, as people expect fans to do, or just to be apathetic in general, or to come to their aid, there's a reason that Saudi Arabia even bought Newcastle United to begin with. Again, it wasn't even the most complex layer to their sports washing. They're certainly buying and planning and strategizing for more complicated ventures in the near future. But Newcastle came with a pre-bought fan base that automatically converts at this rate to just being Saudi apologists.
Yeah.
So Saudi Arabia not only bought a football club that's now platforming them in the Premier League, one of the most prestigious.
Even changed our kits to be their flag's colours, our third away kit.
Truly using it as propaganda at this point, and this massive prestigious platform that they've been given. But on top of that, they bought the fan base as well, who have now basically become Saudi apologists. That's, if anything, no matter how much they paid, they got a deal out of this. Saudi Arabia, they absolutely got a deal out of this.
I mean, it shouldn't. That deal, the Newcastle deal, should never have been allowed. The league rebuffed it in the first instance, and then they allowed the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund to essentially create a shell company, and that was apparently enough of a layer of abstraction that they were allowed to own the team. And you know, the Premier League is a joke for this. They have this what they call a fair and proper persons test. This is the same league that approved Carson Young to buy Birmingham. You know, like, it's a fucking joke. And you know, that was my thing. I didn't want to be in the position where I had to choose to reject my childhood team. I wanted the league safeguards to prevent them from ever owning it in the first place. Yes, I wanted Mike Ashley, the previous owner, to sell, but I didn't want to be Saudi owned. I didn't want us to become just another, you know, like Man City, PSG, where, you know, some oil magnate has a plaything, and it's just something to do on the weekends, if not part of some broader machination, you know. So, yeah, the leagues have really let everybody down, because that is a move that none of the other teams wanted it. There was a large subset of fans that didn't want it. And yet it's been allowed to go ahead with just the most cursory of changes. It's really sad.
Well, we can't separate sports washing from the corruption of the actual sports institutions that allow it. So the step above simply just the organizations like for the Premier League, we have to talk about the problem of corruption in football, because this is also evident in FIFA, which is just giving the World Cup to authoritarian regimes. Like, I mean, how did Qatar get a hold of the World Cup?
Crazy.
Without massive bribery and corruption. Come on. Like, it has to be. And Russia before that. And people, I love that people still use this argument right now when I bring up Russia and the World Cup. Well, they say, well, Putin hadn't attacked Ukraine then. Well, first of all, he had already annexed Crimea, and prior to that had already went to war with Georgia. And prior to that, carpet bombed Grozny in Chechnya, killing thousands and thousands of people. He was already a warmonger. He was already an authoritarian leader. People chose to ignore that. And as a matter of fact,
not to mention he was killing journalists, like, you know, with polonium, and then just denying it and sort of laughing it off. I mean, you know, we're very...
Exactly. And the ones he wasn't killing himself, he was assigning Ramzan Kadyrov to get an assassin to go kill them, like Boris Nemtsov, his opposition, his main opposition at the time. Now he's trying to poison people like Navalny, but prior to that, he had far more significant and, in my opinion, realistic threats like Boris Nemtsov, who he just needed out of the way. And to kill him in broad daylight on the streets of Moscow, like, I passed that bridge where he was shot, and this doesn't happen in a so-called democratic country. But for years, people just pushed this idea that Putin was this fantastic leader, was extraordinarily cunning and smart, and sports went a long way to producing that image for Vladimir Putin. I mean, he had the Olympics before that too. So when you talk about these major entities like the Olympics and FIFA, you are talking about giant mafias. At this point, sports-related mafias, because they don't answer to any one country. They simply don't. They operate on intimidation, threats, and bribery, and they pal around with some of the most dangerous people on the planet. That sounds like a mafia to me.
Well, absolutely. I mean, look, I'll ask one quick question because I've had this argument brought up to me, and somebody said to me recently. They said, "Richard, are you sure that sports washing is actually working?" And I went, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, every time Saudi Arabia does come into the space and spends money to be in a sport, there's this huge debate about the ethics around it. And there will always be at least one spokesperson that brings up the human rights violations, the mistreatment of women. Recently, the stories with Twitter, we had two women being imprisoned for decades for tweets against the regime after essentially a spy was able to infiltrate Twitter and access private information
Also
and keep a list
terrifying.
of dissidents. Yeah, I know, right? But they said, if anything, it's the sports washing that keeps a lot of their human rights violations in the spotlight. And so I sort of have pondered on that a while. It's not that I think that's necessarily wrong. I just kind of think it's maybe a little bit naive. What do you think about that argument?
I think it's an incomplete argument. First of all, because again, we already brought this up a little earlier, which is the different layers in Saudi sports washing goals now, right? It's no longer simply about image laundering. So that's just stage one. They're also trying to simply gain control and gain a foothold over a younger generation that's not reading CNN, Fox, or any of these major media outlets that might have gripes with the deal or have an article out. But actually, let's just focus on image laundering for a second, because when each say when the WWE was one of the first ones to partner up with Saudi Arabia. When that deal first began, I was asked to write several pieces, and we wrote several pieces, and people and editors were interested in it. We've reached a point now that WWE has hosted so many events in Saudi Arabia that it's become basically normalized. You may occasionally get a article complaining about the sports washing, but for the
Mm.
most part, it's happened so many times that people just have gotten used to it. That is another problem you're dealing with. Saudi's like, okay, we know we're going to face this kind of backlash for a while, but eventually people will just get tired of seeing and reading the same thing over and over again, and they're just
Mm.
going to be fine with it. We're going to normalize this. And that's exactly what's been happening, because you're seeing less of those complaints. Hell, you're seeing people being tired of the sports washing talk when it comes to Qatar. It's been happening for years now. We've been talking about, the literal slave labor that's taking place
Yep.
in Qatar, and people just, shrug their shoulders a little bit. Now, you bombard people with the information, it just normalizes it, doesn't get them angry. The outrage doesn't last, as we've seen with the way the media cycle operates now and how social media impacts us. Everything is a trend. It might be a topic of conversation for a few days or a week, but then people move on, no matter
Mm.
how big it. People like Twitter and social media was all talk about the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine when it first started. That's all everybody wanted to talk about, and the flags and the Ukrainian flags everywhere. And that's a war we're talking about, not even just sports washing or something along those lines. We're talking about a war. Within a few weeks, when people realized this wasn't just going to end now, it was going to extend and go on, people got bored and they moved on.
Yeah.
And the topics of conversation online have moved on since. Of course, there's still conversations about the war. There's still reporting going on, all that. But the global discourse has diminished significantly. And if that can happen with war, it can happen with absolutely anything else. It's a fault of just how we operate as humans in the 21st century now. So Saudi is not too concerned about a few articles being published, as long as nothing changes. If those articles don't lead to any significant policy shifts or changes or lobbying against these activities, well, Saudi simply doesn't care at this point. They're not even going to fight the article or come after those journals. I haven't seen that happen in a while. As foreign journalists, of course, that I'm referring to,
Oh yeah, I'm
because
sure.
that would
They're okay.
raise. That would cause them even more problems. Them ignoring it at this point and simply just riding the wave or the storm or whatever it may be is their best hope. Live Golf is going to be a litmus test, I think, Richard, because there was so much coverage. Like I'll say, for the years I've been writing about sports washing in Saudi Arabia, when the Live Golf story broke and those first events were taking place, that was when I got the most media requests from major outlets to do with Saudi Arabia and sports washing. BBC, CNN, all of them wanted something at the time. And as a matter of fact, they're still messaging about that specific thing. I wonder if that's going to last. I wonder the next cycle around, next year's Live Golf season, is it going to be this much of a topic of conversation? Because if it's not, well, then Saudi's winning, right? Even if the thing is being brought up, even if their human rights abuses are being brought up, it's not changing anything. So why do they care?
Yeah, and I feel as well, there's no real, like, look, a journalist talking about it, like you say, Saudi couldn't care less. You need politicians to be pointing these things out, and that's where the juice is. And like, unfortunately, with all the lobbying that gets done, with all their ties to essential industries, with their willingness to invest in infrastructure in foreign countries, with their connections to other big, an entertainment company isn't just a company that churns out films. It's a company that exists in multiple states in America that employs tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, from the people that, from the animators that make the films to someone who puts on a Mickey Mouse head in Disneyland. And the money is everywhere. It's so ubiquitous. So no one's going to rock that particular boat. It seems no one of importance. And until that's why the activism side is so important, because you need to kind of corral a politician that's willing to do the right thing, which, good luck finding one of those these days. Yeah.
And even one politician is not going to be enough if the major figures in your government are crawling on hands and knees to Saudi Arabia, right? And that's what we're seeing right now. You even see, and it's not just going to be Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates is rising as a major influential nation in the Middle East and beyond now as well, and also going to be one of the countries that the European nations rely on heavily for oil and for energy in the foreseeable future as well. So the UAE, which also participates in sports washing, is about to get a lot of the same advantages that Saudi Arabia has. These nations know that the world has changed in 2022 and that the war has positioned them in a very different place. That's why they've been neutral on the war for so many reasons. That's why they know that there's a sort of a global shift that's about to happen, and it's coming out in their favor. Just today, actually, Saudi Arabia's energy minister was asked about the reason for OPEC not increasing oil production as President Joe Biden requested. And his response was so telling, Richard. It really, really was. His response was, Saudi Arabia lives to keep people on their toes. They enjoy this. They absolutely, and I have to say, I'm not referring to the Saudi people. I have nothing against any people of any country that I ever write about. I'm only ever talking about the authoritarian governments in charge. When I'm saying Saudi, I'm referring to the government here. This government, this monarchy, this kingdom, whatever you want to call it, this royal family, they live for this. They live for this. They spent for decades, America was in control of Saudi Arabia. They helped build that country in many ways because of the oil discoveries. They helped build a lot of the cities. There are books written about all this, about how much the Saudis learned from the Americans, bringing them TVs, bringing them all sorts of things. You had this very colonized mentality, and that held tight with the people of Saudi Arabia. For them to see, and for this government and for this monarchy to now see the switch of them being in complete control and having the others grovel to them and come to them on hands and knees, they love this. This is what they live for at this point. So if we're expecting, any magnanimous behavior, any, wonderful relationships in the future with these countries, just because you've now come to them on their terms, good luck with that.
Yeah. We'll wrap up the Saudi talk with a little bit about the esports aspect of it and why I'm particularly concerned, because there's one thing Saudi Arabia can do in the world of esports it cannot do in the world of sports, and that is effectively own the intellectual property. One of the huge differences that creates a raft of legal problems within our space is that ultimately the game's developer own the intellectual property. So if you want to run a tournament, it must be done with their blessing, because they can essentially say, well, you don't have a license to do it. We will sue you. So what's increasingly happened is Saudi Arabia are starting to buy huge amounts of shares, huge amounts of stock, getting people on the boards of games development companies. In September, they just unveiled something called the National Gaming and Esports Strategy. There were a number of colleagues of mine that sort of went out there to kind of like, speak and meet because, they're not as adverse to making money, I guess, as I appear to be in my career. But they said as early as July this year, we're coming for esports. There was a lot of in 2020 they had a little dabble with the Neon partnerships that came in. Obviously, there was a successful Neon partnership in Formula One. They tried to replicate that in esports, and the fans revolted to the point where Blast and Riot Games both cancelled their Neon sponsorships. And that led to the executive in charge of the Neon project. Apparently, this was reported in the Wall Street Journal. He threatened to pull a gun out and shoot the people in the meeting. But just to give you some of the numbers, they bought 1/3 of a Japanese gaming company, SNK Corporation. I think they then expanded that, so it's like they now own something like 96% on paper. They bought $3 billion worth of stock at a time when Activision were in all the headlines for all the wrong reasons. They were the only people that increased their position at that time. They bought stock in Electronic Arts. They bought stock in Take-Two, again, both companies that create esports properties. FIFA and Madden at Electronic Arts. Take-Two obviously is the NBA license game. They bought stakes in Capcom, which makes fighting games like Street Fighter. They bought shares in Nexom, which they make a load of free-to-play games for the Asian market. And of course, the big talking point is they spent $1.5 billion to buy ESL, the largest esports league company that, occupies 80% of the calendar. And face it, who was a rival of ESL in terms of they did event management and they ran a rival pugging company, now both owned by the Savvy Gaming Group. The chairman of the board of the Savvy Gaming Group is Bin Salman. So that's all happened in 2 years. And then just a few months ago, they ran something called the Gamers 8, which had $15 million worth of prize pool, the biggest ever in the Middle East. Again, it's just now we're at a point where it's completely normalized, and essentially Saudi Arabia are not just going to be able to run the tournaments, put up the prize pool, own the companies. They're going to essentially be behind making the games. So no one will be able to tell them no. If you want to play, you're doing it at their behest. You're doing it with their permission.
And it's something that their own people, their own countrymen are never going to fight them on, because now they get to be involved in making all these incredible games. So you've got a lot of these Saudi gamers, a lot of these intelligent, extraordinarily intelligent Saudi nationals who are Western educated, who will now have job opportunities creating some of the most, important games to come, or the biggest games that'll be coming out. It completely shifts everything, because that secures a significant portion of their own population, which is, I'm seeing it myself whenever I'm in Egypt. I see how many people love games now, and gaming, how big of a deal it is. I see it with all my friend groups. Saudi being involved in that completely shifts even their perspective on the country. So it's multi-pronged, multi-layered, this kind of sports washing approach. I'm finding now that as we talk more about this and we talk about the depths that they will go to in the strategizing, I find that honestly the term sports washing in itself now is under-equipped to describe what's going on.
It's blasé. Yeah.
It is, isn't it? But it's still, I think, the country at the moment that fascinates me. When people ask why, when it comes to the topic of sports washing, you're covering Saudi Arabia so much. Well, because Saudi Arabia, I have to admit, fascinates me. They're the ones who have taken this concept and really advanced it. When I spent a lot of the past decade writing about how Vladimir Putin utilized sports washing and combat, and sports, from combat sports onwards to FIFA and the Olympic Games, how he really utilized sports as a significant part and weaponized it for his own for his own regime. Putin's relied a lot on traditional forms of sports diplomacy, this displays of masculinity, uh, old style Soviet propaganda where he's presented as this, this great judo practitioner.
Mm.
Yeah, this health and strength and masculinity approach, which worked with his people, but it is uh, simple, right? It is the first stage of what would something that Saudi would take, because that's not necessarily what bin Salman was interested in presenting, this idea of masculinity, etc. Well, they're in complete control, extremely patriarchal society. He wanted to take it a step further, right? And expand this strategy. So when you take a look at like Putin's strategy for combat for sports washing versus Mohammed bin Salman's, well, it's night and day, isn't it? And you can only write so much about Putin's, especially since his sports empire has collapsed at this point. But the one on the rise and the one that's going to, I feel, unfortunately stick with us for a while is Saudi Arabia's sports
Yes.
empire.
Yeah, it is. Maybe not the most dangerous people you've ever written about. Because obviously you and I have become somewhat stoic in the face of death threats. I've had some credible ones, had some Russian mobsters that were very keen to find out where I lived when I was living in the States. And, a few bits and pieces, but generally it's just crazy people. It's not, it's not organized crime or whatever. But you, of course, have written about probably one of the most dangerous figures to actually write about, and that is our friend Ramzan Kadyrov. That's the head of the Chechen Republic. I mean, again, this guy, we could do a whole show just on him, but for people that don't know, obviously, a thoroughly nasty person since he seized power, been frequently accused of assassinations, as you said earlier, has no issue with torturing anyone who speaks out against the regime. I think even recently there was a story where he was supposedly linked with having Fedor's daughter attacked or something over comments Fedor might have made. He made some comments as if to insinuate he'd been responsible for it, I think.
So that's an interesting that little thing about attacking Fedor is an interesting one because it goes to show you the danger of Kadyrov extends beyond Kadyrov himself. So Kadyrov put out a statement talking about how upset he was that how dare Fedor speak out on the fact that Kadyrov was having his underage children fight in unsanctioned
yes.
MMA fight. He never, from what I understand, having reported on the story, he never personally sent out somebody to attack Fedor. What happened is that Fedor and Fedor's daughter were walking by, and somebody who was clearly extremely loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov kicked him at that point. That's something you have to worry about when it comes to Ramzan Kadyrov, is that it's not simply him or his assassins or whatever that you have to worry about. It's anybody loyal to him. If he puts out a message, anybody loyal to him could take it upon themselves to take action. Those are the people you got to worry about. It's very similar to Salman Rushdie being attacked recently on stage. A fatwa was put out in Iran, but it wasn't an Irani. It wasn't an Irani that attacked him in the end, right? It was a Shia Muslim, sure, but it was somebody who had taken this message, consumed it, and honed it, and really wanted to go on the attack. So sometimes you gotta fear for these, what you call, I guess, lone wolves on top of it. I think that's what had happened in that case. But Kadyrov himself has been linked to a slew of assassinations, forced disappearances, purges of Chechnya's LGBTQ plus community. He's truly the type of evil you would see in like James Bond movies back in the day. Yeah. He's that sort of trademark movie type evil.
So tell me about his ties to UFC. I mean, why does a guy like Kadyrov, why would he need to even be involved in sports? Again, we understand the long con of the Saudi Arabian regime. We understand why Qatar are doing their thing with the World Cup. What's Kadyrov's end game from you, someone that has written about him extensively?
I think Kadyrov also has one of those really fascinating blueprints when it comes to sports, sports strategy. It's something I like to call sports socialization. So Kadyrov took over Chechnya in 2007. His father, let's start it this way. Chechnya in the 1990s had a really troubled history and significant issues with Islamic insurgency, terrorism, and got into a multiple conflicts, civil wars with the Russian Federation, first under Boris Yeltsin and then under Vladimir Putin the second time around. Both were extremely bloody conflicts. Chechnya came out on top, if you can even call what had happened to them a victory, but they certainly did not lose to Yeltsin's Russian army. In comes Putin, who basically carpet bombs Grozny to the ground and brings the republic to its knees, and once again occupies Chechnya and brings it under the scope of the Russian Empire. He did this by having his main opposition in Chechnya was a man called Ahmed Haji Kadyrov. Ahmed Haji Kadyrov switched sides to Putin's side, fought for Putin, and ended up basically eliminating the insurgents in the country. He was looking around him in Chechnya and thought to himself, you know what? There's way too much Islamic insurgency. There's way too much Wahhabism on the rise. Nothing good's going to come from this. I'd rather take the devil I know, being Vladimir Putin. That's the story told about Ahmed Kadyrov's decision. Ahmed Kadyrov happened to be Ramzan Kadyrov's father. They both fought in that Second Chechen War. Kadyrov held a militia that he continues to control in Chechnya called the Kadyrovtsi. This very, very horrifically bloody, dangerous militia group. So Ahmed Kadyrov ended up becoming the first technically president of Chechnya, occupied Chechnya, under Vladimir Putin. He, though, was assassinated with a bomb at a football stadium in 2004.
Yeah.
3 years later, Kadyrov, his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, takes power. And he takes power in a very tense Chechnya with a significant power vacuum. So the first thing he does is he consolidates power. He assassinates all his foes, including assassinations that he committed in Dubai, of all places, and eventually consolidates his power. Within a few years, he realizes, okay, well, I don't simply just have the problem of, potential foes. I have the problem of this Islamic insurgency that's taking place and this guerrilla warfare that's happening in the mountains. So what can I do? What can I do? And he turns to what Dagestan actually did. Dagestan being a neighboring republic in the North Caucasus, where poverty, insurgency, and these issues of a lack of, economic vitality and social mobility were very significant in Dagestan. And wrestling, combat sports and wrestling became one of these alternative avenues for young men. Kadyrov saw this and thought, you know what, maybe I can expand on this. So he started making famous Chechen athletes, Olympic champions, come and spend time with him and sort of promote their achievements and their accolades to the Chechen people. Eventually, he would start a fight club and a mixed martial arts gym called the Ahmed MMA Fight Club. He did this in 2015 when I was in Russia at the time. And he started having some of the best fighters in Chechnya come and train there and officially represent his fight club. He basically elevated this group of Chechen athletes to become Chechnya's utter elite, the absolute elite, celebrity status elite. And within a few years, he slowly started to convert Chechen heritage into one of these proud mountaineers with a significant history, especially a history of opposing the Russian Empire, to being an enclave of Russia under Russian control that is primarily interested in combat sports. And combat sports in service to Ramzan Kadyrov. You're only good to Ramzan. A Chechen man is only good to Ramzan Kadyrov in two forms, and that's the sort of his hyper-Chechen masculinity at talk here. He either wants you to fight for him in a cage as an athlete and represent Chechnya that way, or he wants you to fight for him on a battlefield. Those are the only two ways a young Chechen man can prove himself to Ramzan Kadyrov. So this is part of this socialization strategy that he implemented after taking control. He did this with a lot of propaganda, He turned his father into a martyr and an idol. So he named the fight club after his father, Ahmed. So the Ahmed Fight Club, and they've got this saying in Chechnya, it's called Ahmed Sila, which translates to Ahmed Strength or Ahmed Power. So you'll always find them chanting. It's this mantra that they have. They even use it during, like when they're out on the battlefield in Ukraine. You'll hear them, they'll gather together, they'll take a picture, and they'll chant Ahmed Sila. It's a show of strength, not to Russia, but to Ramzan Kadyrov and his father Ahmed Kadyrov, what they see as the dynasty in charge of Chechnya right now. Sports played a significant role in that, in this sort of socialization strategy in Chechnya. So Kadyrov really utilized combat sports, boxing and MMA, as a way to completely redefine Chechnya's identity overall, making it the national sport of Chechnya, while at the same time distracting from its human rights abuses and retraining men uh, to be interested specifically in sports and that route in life rather than anything else. So that kind of recalibration is uh, horrific. It's continues to take place to this day, but it's also extremely cunning and extremely uh, successful. Let's put it that way. Unfortunately, he's been extremely successful at this.
Has there been any pushback? Because obviously we've entered a weird time in terms of Russia, not just Putin's government, in my opinion, but, you know, Russian people and supporters of the Russian state have sort of become international pariahs. And, you know, whereas, I don't know if there would be any need of a company like the UFC to express any commentary around that. It seems that for American companies right now, there is this kind of expectation that you are very much on the Ukrainian side of the equation and you will speak up in support of Ukraine, and anybody that has ties to Putin's government are going to be sanctioned. There's a lot of that going on right now. So has recent geopolitical events kind of like, you know, halted Kadyrov's influence in MMA and beyond?
Well, I'd say it hasn't, to be honest with you. Why? Because combat sports has sort of flown under the radar when it comes to Russia sanctions, etc. First of all, I did definitely forget to mention that part of Kadyrov's achievements with his sports socialization strategy and his Akhmat MMA Fight Club is that several of the fighters that train, that absolutely, utterly represent him, his official fighters, his favorite fighters, compete in the UFC right now. So he gets this sort of added layer of attention and promotion from the UFC by having his own fighters represented and platformed on the world's largest and most recognizable mixed martial arts organization. So that's a huge boon for Kadyrov and continues to this very day, as a matter of fact. One of the UFC's primary stars is Khamzat Chimaev, and Chimaev is Kadyrov's favorite fighter. He's actually in Chechnya right now. If you go on his stories, or if you go on you will find the images of him sitting with Kadyrov right now, actually. So Khamzat Chimaev absolutely thrives on that relationship with Kadyrov, and it's something that hasn't impacted his relationship at all with the UFC, as a matter of fact. So here are the things that have happened, and they don't necessarily relate to each other. So you've got the fact that the UFC hasn't had to cut ties with any of its Russian athletes. It hasn't even cut its Russian broadcasting deal, as a matter of fact, even though a lot of other sports institutions have. The UFC has decided that they don't really need to do any of this. They've flown under the radar for the most part, and they set the bar so low when it comes to, just being, morally, having any sort of moral standards or obligations, that they've set the bar so low that nobody expects anything from them to this day. So they can just fly under the radar and do what they feel like. So in that sense, they've literally done nothing whatsoever, except I think they no longer allow fighters to walk out with flags, and that only really started after the war. So they're not letting any fighter walk out with flags. It's not just Russia and Ukraine, it's any fighter with any flag at this point. So who knows what that means for them, but they still have Russian fighters competing regularly, whether on US soil, including their Chechen fighters like Chimaev, on US soil with no issues whatsoever, and for the most part nobody really seems to care. But the U.S. government has actually reacted in interesting ways over the last few years. In December 2020, they sanctioned Ramzan Kadyrov himself has been sanctioned since 2017 under the Global Magnitsky Act, which is some of the highest levels of sanctions you can face from the U.S. State Department or the U.S. Treasury Department. But in 2020, they actually sanctioned his fight club on top of that, stating that it provides pride and profit to Ramzan Kadyrov. Fantastic. Yet, even though they sanctioned him, the UFC felt no obligation to cut ties with any of the fighters associated to Ramzan Kadyrov. Their argument, or the primary sort of legal loophole or blind spot that they're relying on right now is the fact that UFC fighters are independent contractors, not employees.
Mm.
So as independent the UFC technically enters a contract with the individual fighter, not with the team that fighter represents. Therefore, their actual one-on-one ties to Kadyrov or his entities are technically minimal, aren't they? If we go
Yeah.
by that technicality or that legal loophole
And
that
I'm
they
sure by
provide.
design, right? Mm.
It's unfortunate that sort of independent contractor status is the gift that keeps on giving for the UFC. It really, really is.
Mm.
Uh, Interestingly enough, just last week, the State Department issued sanctions again on Ramzan Kadyrov, this time tying him to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Here's where we start answering your question a bit more. There was one peculiar line in there, and I haven't actually reported this yet, written an article about this yet, because I'm still working through it. Is Ramzan Kadyrov's fight clubs, as Ramzan Kadyrov has been known to use mixed martial arts to recruit for his ongoing war effort in Ukraine. This is something I have written about in the past, but now we're seeing it actually, being referenced in U.S. sanctioned press releases. That tells me that the US government is far more aware of Ramzan Kadyrov and the UFC relationship than it was before the war. So, yes, to an extent, we have seen probably more awareness being raised because of the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. But as to the consequences, we haven't seen any of those yet.
Right. Yeah, I mean it's crazy. I would have thought, again, there was a time in UFC's history where being adjacent to somebody like that would have been really detrimental to their mission statement. They worked so hard to clean themselves up, to get away from the mafias and the organized crime and all the negative influences, to find a concession, a middle ground where, yes, it's a combat sport, but it's not a blood sport. It's not brutality, to appease, mainstream American fight sanctioning bodies. And, now that we're here, I mean, like you say, almost everything that the UFC is kind of doing, the types of sponsorship it's attracting, the deals it's giving the fighters, the type of fighters that are being platformed and promoted, and the people they're adjacent to. And I mean, I've seen photographs of Kadyrov. I like, meeting like just mainstream MMA stars and mainstream combat sports stars. There's photographs of him high-fiving Mike Tyson, and it's like,
Mike Tyson was the very first athlete to ever visit Ramzan Kadyrov from abroad, actually. The very first one.
right, okay.
He's visited more than once, actually, but the very first time he visited was, I think, a year after Kadyrov's father was killed. And Kadyrov wasn't even the president of Chechnya yet at that point. He was
Wow.
still vice president trying to sort of, politic his way into power. And one of the things he did do to gain the support of his people was to bring in Mike Tyson, one of the most, at the time, one of those famous Muslim stars, and, he just converted to Islam, and people loved Mike Tyson, and he still had this sort of aura of mystique and power. So he brings Mike Tyson, and this photo op with Mike Tyson and him, and that surrounded by so many people was one of those for one of the first times Kadyrov really saw the benefit of using people like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I guess, it's never going to be anything that they're going to comment on. I mean, Dana White pretty much plays to the beat of his own drum these days.
He's a big Donald Trump supporter, and there's a reason why when I talk about sports washing, I don't limit it to authoritarian regimes. Is because you have this so-called democratic country in the United States of America that had the exact same problem with Donald Trump. So the UFC regularly promoted Donald Trump, not just Dana White, not just the fighters, but the UFC itself as a supposedly apolitical sports entity was creating hagiography propaganda documentaries on Donald Trump, titling them things like combatant in chief.
I remember when he went to, I can't remember which event it was, but there was one event particularly where he went out and he got a big pop from the crowd, and
Oh yeah,
it
in New
felt
York,
it
I
felt
think.
Yeah, it felt like a WWE event almost, and they were like, the commentators going, and Donald Trump, big supporter of the UFC in the early years, and like you say, they had a little narrative sting for the
Oh
whole,
yeah.
for the whole thing. Yeah,
No,
it
the
was
whole
very
Trump
Eastern
family.
European. It was, yeah.
And the Trump family really utilized this sort of connection with the UFC. I mean, Trump invited Dana White to speak at the Republican National Convention 2016 and 2020. Then he had him on the campaign trail with him, speaking at multiple different campaign stops. He's Donald Trump Jr. hosted a Fighters Against Socialism bus tour where he had Jorge Masvidal headlining, teaching having, going up on stage and talking about the woes and horrors of socialism, to an audience. What does that have to do with the UFC exactly?
Yeah, I remember Masvidal campaigning in Florida. Yeah,
Oh yeah, and then he was one of the people who was heavy on the train of election fraud, etc. You've had MMA fighters actually participating in the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. Then you had UFC legends like Pat Miletich standing outside the Capitol taking pictures with the Proud Boys. MMA really has a authoritarianism problem. It truly, truly does, and it's not being addressed at all. And it's not limited to the United States. It's not limited to its relationship, with fringe dictators or with evil figures like Ramzan Kadyrov. This is happening everywhere. You've had tons of Brazilian MMA fighters support and promote and
Bolsonaro.
campaign for
Yeah.
Bolsonaro. Yeah, and it's still ongoing. You've absolute legends of the sport like Vitor Belfort, Vanderlei Silva. All of these people are hardcore Bolsonaro supporters. There's a significant link between mixed martial arts and right-wing and sometimes far-right ideology. And it's something that we need to continue exploring. We need to understand why this is happening.
Yeah. You've written extensively about Kadyrov. Has there been any fallback? Has there been any repercussions, because of that? Because, obviously with the proximity to MMA, and I know you've had problems with the UFC in the past, that seems to me, like you say, I think Saudi aren't going to target foreign journalists, there's almost no need anymore. But Kadyrov strikes me as the kind of guy that if there was an opportunity to shut somebody up or to get somebody to shut somebody up on his behalf, I think he would take it.
Kadyrov absolutely would, unfortunately.
Mm.
That's at least that's what we've seen in the past. There's been quite a few journalists that have been either assaulted or straight up assassinated by Ramzan Kadyrov. For the most part, they are usually Russian journalists. As a matter of fact, it's Russian women that he despises the most. And that goes to show you a lot about Kadyrov's views on women as well, is that he can tolerate a lot in his life, apparently, but a woman speaking out against him is something he can simply not tolerate. That's why Anna Politkovskaya was one of the people who was assassinated. Natalia Estemova is another one who was assassinated. You've got multiple journalists for the Novaya Gazeta now who are women who write about Kadyrov, who are exiled from the country, basically, have never been able to return since then. You have dissidents across Europe being targeted by Kadyrov and his allies, whether it be in Austria, in Germany, in France, even. We're talking Western European countries that Kadyrov can just, send his assassins into, and it doesn't seem to be too much of a trouble for him really at all. So he's got influence that expands into Europe as well. This is a person who has a significant ego and pride and doesn't like hearing things spoken against him. This is not really the most diplomatic human being on earth either, right? But there's a reason I stressed a lot of these people for the fact that they were Russian and women, etc., because those are really his primary targets. I have received threats. I have received credible threats from Kadyrov and his allies before, but that is not to say that I am the one who is at most risk here. It's not
Yeah.
the same thing at all. I have been one of the lucky ones whose work has gained more recognition in things like HBO, etc., which put a target on my back in that sense. But The people who are really risking their lives on a day-to-day basis are the ones who are doing this kind of reporting while being in extremely close proximity to Ramzan Kadyrov. I have taken significant steps over the past few years to hide my identity as much as possible, to hide my location as much as possible. And I continue to do that, unfortunately. This affected things like my own wedding a few years ago, where all the guests were told at the time, here's the location, you cannot share this, pictures cannot be geolocated, all sorts of things like that. I'd have loved to have probably lived a life where that kind of thing was not a worry. But
Yeah.
I remind myself every day, this is not something I'm just saying here to be modest or anything like that. This is something I tell myself every day. I am not the one at most risk. There are people who are far braver, doing far more than what I'm doing. They're the ones who should be asked this question, to be honest with you, and I consider myself both lucky and privileged.
Yeah. Look, we're almost at time. So I want to ask you.
That flew by the way.
I know, right? I knew it would once we got into it. But yeah, look, I wanna ask you about what sports fans can do, because maybe it's a bit much to talk about activism for the average sports fan. Where does it start? If you are concerned about sports washing, if you don't want to support the Saudi regime, if you don't want to support the Chinese regime or the Russian regime or whatever it is, what are the steps that you can take to create a pressure where there might be some positive outcome?
I think it really begins with being more empathetic as a human being, willing to be more aware of the things going on around you. People ask me all the time, what do you intend to gain from the articles you write? I said, all I can gain, I view myself at this point as an educator more than anything. All I can expect to gain from this is that people become aware of the situation.
Mm.
I'm not expecting any groundbreaking or earth-shattering changes or policy shifts based simply on my reporting. That's asking too much. That's setting the bar way too high and asking for failure every time and time again. All I can really hope for is that sports fans become more empathetic to the situation, more aware of what's going on around them, and more willing to speak out when it really matters. Now, for the ones that want to be more active, there are steps you can take in the world of activism, starting grassroots organizations in opposition. Hell, picking up the phone and talking to your local politicians if it's in the context of something that's, for instance, you're talking about Newcastle, you're talking about things where you want to have your local politicians, your municipal government involved in some way. Tell your congressperson how you're feeling, what's bothering you, because it's that kind of pressure, exerting that kind of pressure. If enough people speak out, they cannot be ignored. And even if it seems like only minimal advancements at first, well, it has to begin somewhere. But if you are self-defeatist from the very beginning and tell yourself, well, there's no way we can do this or achieve this, well, then you've already handed the victory over to Saudi Arabia. Because I could have done the same thing. I could have said, based on the conversation we had today, Richard, we didn't exactly give people much hope in terms of what the response.
Well, I think where we differ is I don't have any hope. Like I think we're in end stage esports, in my world. I think we've entered into the esports I know from 20 years ago when it was a new thing, and the thing I helped build, I think it's been torn down. I don't think it exists, and I think what has been put in its place, it isn't worth saving. I would only want to see it destroyed at this point and rebuilt, and it cannot be done because there's too much money. So, I mean, that's where I'm at mentally. I mean, I might not be. In a year, I might have an epiphany and, change. But I think where we differ is I've kind of I have lost a lot of hope about fixing these problems. I think no one wants to come along for the ride with me anymore, like they used to 15 years ago.
I understand. I think the difference is not just in our personalities or anything like that. I think the difference lies in the fact that you got to see esports from its beginning stages, right? From the early stages, from what it could have been to what it's become, right? This transformation now in the span of 20 years. Sports and sports washing as a concept has been around a lot longer than either of us have existed, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, 1936 Olympics with Hitler is an easy example. Hell, I can take us back to the ancient Egyptians when, the pharaohs used to love hosting these big wrestling tournaments against, Nubia nearby, etc., to show their superiority over the darker skinned Nubians, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, this is something that almost is a part of human history in many ways. This idea of sports as a form of diplomacy and dominance and display of propaganda. So for me, if I had since I never saw a world that's anything different, I have to try and believe that there's something that can be done, no matter how minimal or minuscule. Because at the very least, if we set up the environment for change and produce these tools and provide people with avenues and alternatives to explore, well, then when the time does come for change, at least we are not underprepared and we are not going to be swept up in simply what Saudi Arabia has to control, which is their money, their influence, and their resources.
Mm.
There has to be I have to believe somewhere. I am a skeptical person by nature, mind you. I have to believe somewhere that this cannot be all over, just like that. But what do I know at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard, man. I mean, I'm gonna keep doing what I can, but it feels like, you're running into a brick wall, and it's just that willingness to pick yourself up and run into it again, and then again and again, the wall remains. You're gonna break before the wall does. I think that's
I'll
how I
say
feel.
this. If I can see, if you're talking about achievements for me, what I would consider to be like an achievement, something that's like, oh, finally, I have seen something good come out of this reporting. Other than, I love hearing from people telling me it's because of you that I've learned about this. It's because of you that I'm more aware. I
Mm.
see that as a victory. I see that as a victory when that happens. But if you're talking about actual more consequential results, if I can see Ramzan Kadyrov's fighters and Ramzan Kadyrov completely lose his avenue to promote his fighters and himself and his platform in the United States or on UFC programming, I'll consider that a victory against sports washing.
Yeah.
But I can only work in such small spaces like that.
I know, and what one story at a time, right? So,
True.
that takes me to the very last question. It's how I always end the podcast. It's what are you going to be working on? There'll be a bunch of people who are watching this that want to follow your work, are interested in what you're doing next. What is next on the horizon for you? What are you tackling?
So for those who want to follow me, you can follow me at on Twitter. Really, that's the primary place for the vast majority of my reporting, and that's at Zidan Sports. But really, I'm just going to be going into a lot more detail in the topics we've been talking about today. I plan on doing a deep dive into Saudi sports washing strategy when it comes to esports. So
Mm.
you and I are going to have a few more conversations, I think, about this, Richard,
No,
because
no doubt.
it's a world that absolutely fascinates me. I think is underreported. For the most part, there's a lot of mainstream publications that simply don't want to touch this world of esports, and I think that's something we need to start to change because at least drawing more attention might be the first step. Who knows? Who knows here? But at least it's what I can do. There's definitely more on the horizon when it comes to the Kadyrov story, the Kadyrov, Chimaev, and sanctions story. I already had started doing that for the New York Times. I'm expecting that there will be follow-up pieces in the near future.
Mm.
Apart from that, just expect really more coverage of sports and sports washing. We're heading into the World Cup. I definitely have a couple of ideas for some narrative pieces. On the issues on speaking to actual migrants who have suffered in Qatar. So I'm hoping to find a home for those stories in the near future.
Awesome. Well, I hope you do, and yeah, we'll get together, and I'll try and be as neutral as I can in getting you up to speed on the horror of esports. But honestly, I agree, man. It flew by. We'll have to do it again sometime soon.
Absolutely.
Wonderful getting your insight and your thoughts, and yeah, just great to talk to somebody that's trying to do good work in the space. So, guys, there it is. That is the great Karim Zidan. Make sure you follow him on his Twitter. It really is good. It's not just his original reporting, any major stories from the world of sports, particularly ones that intersect with politics. You're going to find that there. It's a really great feed, criminally underfollowed with just 20,000 follows. So get that up. That needs to be way, way higher for the type of work he's doing. And that was The Richard Lewis Show. As always, I'll be back soon. I never know when. I never know who the guest's going to be, but whoever it'll be awesome. Make sure you tune in. Make sure you share this with your friends. You like, comment, subscribe, all that Zoomer shit. And I'll see you on the next episode. Until then, take care. Bye.